Recording in progress.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to Lucia de Lammermoor. Well, you might be a little confused. You signed up for Lucia de Lammermoor, and this sounds like we're going to do a study on harp concerti of the 19th century. But this is actually the beginning of the second scene of Act 1 of the opera. And it shows you some originality on the part of Donizetti. I've often talked about this with Verdi and his use of instruments, his type of orchestration. And Donizetti, who precedes him, is also looking for different colors, different instruments to set the mood for a scene. This is a very romantic scene, and why not begin with the harp? So, this is going to be the third opera in a row in which the work is based on some important theatrical or literary work. If you recall, Don Carlos, which you did this a number of weeks ago, is based on a play by Friedrich von Schiller. 2 weeks ago we did Turandot. That's based on a play by Carlo Gozzi. Well, today, Lucia de Lammermoor is based on a novel, The Bride of Lammermoor, which comes from several series of tales called the Landlord Tales, and none of them have anything to do with a landlord, so try to explain to me why it was called that. The author, Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott, I don't think he's been terribly well treated by history, certainly on our side of the Atlantic. I don't know if anyone really reads him anymore. I remember it was in high school or maybe junior high. One year in our English class we were given the choice of reading Ivanhoe or The Yearling. And my mother maybe saved me and said, "You better not read Ivanhoe, you'll never get through it." And so I chose The Yearling. But unfortunately, she forgot to tell me that the character in the title has to be put down. And I found that much more upsetting probably than someone being killed in Ivanhoe. Sir Walter Scott, it's very heavy writing, a lot of Scottish dialect in it. Somebody had once suggested I read a short story by him called The Two Drovers, and I didn't get past the first sentence. But he's a major literary figure, innovative figure, and I thought maybe this would be his moment to shine and talk a little bit about him. Though I have to say from the beginning, there's virtually no contact or connection between Scott and music. You do have some 19th century writers like Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen, Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, who wrote opera libretti. I'm not saying that Hugo, as we discussed before with him, was passionate about music, but he had a connection to music. Scott apparently had no knowledge of music whatsoever. And he was interested in national songs, but only as long as he knew the history behind them. And he would set some new lyrics to some old Irish and Welsh songs, some 11 of them. But otherwise, you don't really come across him in music very much. So he's born in 1871 in Edinburgh, Scotland. And his father was a solicitor, and he'll follow in his footsteps and study law at Edinburgh University. Apparently entered at the age of 9 or 10, which also seems it was not uncommon for that to happen. I should add that he was a very large man, very tall, over 6 foot, very strong and powerful. But he did have a childhood disease which rendered one of his legs lame, and then for the rest of his life. But he still had upper body strength. And in 1792, he's called to the bar. He's going to plead cases, but he's very picky. He only takes on cases that will be extremely rewarding financially. And in 1799, he's going to be elected or chosen the sheriff of Selkirkshire County. This is all in southeastern Scotland, where he's going to live the rest of his life. And in 1806, he becomes the clerk for the Court of Sessions. This was the High and the Royal Scottish Court. And apparently he fulfilled his duties very faithfully. He was a very hard worker. And even though he's starting to write poetry by the early 1800s, he'd already promised himself that his income would be derived from his legal positions, not from his writings. So, going back a couple years, in 1797, he marries a French girl by the name of Charlotte Carpenter, or Charpentier. Her parents were from Lyon. And he was a voracious reader, and I didn't get enough clarity on this. He either knew these languages or he read translations of the major works in, of course, English repertory, but French, German, Italian, Latin, and Spanish. I did come across that he did some German translations. One, Bruegel's novel called Leonore. French, I am assuming he picked up from his wife. So it is possible that he was fairly proficient in the other languages. This is a little bit earlier than when translations come about of major writings of the day. I might as well get into that now. This is going to be in the 1820s, and obviously it's going to affect Scott and his writings, where suddenly there is an interest in foreign literature. And this is all part of early Romanticism, part of the Shakespearean revival. Keep in mind that Shakespeare was not the great bard. after his death in 1616. It's going to take 2 centuries for him to, in essence, reestablish himself. And we have very bad translations of his plays starting in the 18th century. But it's in the 1820s or so that we start to have very good translations and, in fact, very good editions of his plays and being done in England. So, along with Shakespeare, you're going to have even James Fenimore Cooper, who's going to be translated in the 1820s, and someone like Berlioz will pick up the book and be fascinated by his stories of America. Goethe's Faust is translated into French in 1829 and is being translated in other languages. Manzoni, the great Italian novelist, gets translated beginning in 1823. Byron is another in the 1820s. And so these are going to become very familiar names to the populations of countries all across Europe. And Scott is again in that group, certainly in the 1820s. And he's going to have a great impact with his type of writing, in particular with the historical novel. So, while he's performing his legal duties, in 1814 he's going to write his first so-called historical novel, which is often considered the first true historical novel. It's called Waverley. And we've had other attempts at it, but he's the one that really perfects the form and establishes the form of the historical novel, meaning that the era that's going to be used for the novel takes place before the birth of the author. It's not going to be contemporaneous with the author's life. And a very important part of the historical novel is accuracy, so that you'll have a fictional character or a fictional hero, heroine, surrounded by non-fictional characters. And history of that time is going to play an important part. And it was up to the author to research very carefully this epoch and describe it in a very vivid fashion in the story. And even though you have attempts at historical novels dating back to the 17th century in France, for instance, a woman by the name of Marie-Madeleine de la Vergue, who wrote the novel La Princesse des Clèves, which is considered the first attempt at a historical novel. It's really Scott that perfects it and then has a tremendous impact on other writers throughout the 19th century. Now, in 1802, he starts to be published. It's basically his poetry. And this will be with a publisher named James Ballantyne. And they become rather close, so that in 1805, Scott becomes a partner in the firm. But in 1813, Ballantyne suffers serious financial woes. A lot of the debt is going to fall on the shoulders of Scott. And in 1826, in 1813 still, there's either a merger or a buyout of the firm by Archibald Constable, who himself goes under in 1826, which piles on more debt on Scott. And he'll never repay it in his lifetime. He dies in 1832. But the debt will eventually be paid long after his death, and not by, obviously, his legal activities, but by his writings. So with the publication of Waverley in 1814, he buys a small spread, a little farmhouse in Abbotsford, which is southeastern Scotland, and expands it slowly, and so it becomes a real estate. Initially it had 120 acres. By the time of his death, it had grown to 1,200 acres. And he's going to become part of a commission called the Northern Lights Commission, which was set up in 1786 in response to a very bad year of severe storms that hit the coastline of Scotland. This was back in 1782. And even though you had already some lighthouses in existence, they realized they needed to have more. So this commission was set up, giving it powers to borrow money, to buy property, and to build lighthouses. And he becomes one of the commissioners. So he travels a lot around Scotland, a lot, of course, on the coastline. And he uses his travels to do historical research on these areas, which will become very useful when he puts his novels together. And that's why, again, his novels are historically very accurate. So his wife sadly passes away in, was it around 1825 or 26, and after that his health goes downhill. He does go to Paris in 1826, and he attends a performance of Ivanhoe, which was a pastiche of Rossini's music put to the story of Ivanhoe. And I do have a quote of his opinion of this production. It was superbly got up, but it was an opera, and of course the story sadly mangled and the dialogue in part nonsense. You get the sense that he didn't care much for opera, and he certainly didn't like it when somebody used his storyline and then so-called mangled it. In 1831, he's going to go to Italy, first time, spend 6 months. It's an effort to restore his health, but it only gets worse because he becomes very much involved in social life and sightseeing, and returns to Abbotsford and has a stroke and passes away in 1832. Now, he not only had a great influence on literature, but also on music. There are some 60 operas that are based on Scott stories. Amongst them, there is the Jolie Fille de Perthes by Bizet. There's A Lady of the Lake by Rossini, which was given a couple of years ago at the Met for the first time, I think ever. You also have some choral music, cantatas, songs. Schubert wrote 8 songs based on Scott, 7 using the text from Lady of the Lake, which includes the famous Ave Maria. And surprisingly, there are no symphonic poems. I think we talked about symphonic poems. Maybe I didn't at Prosser. Very descriptive symphonic music in a single movement that describes an incident in history, a character, a mythological character, historical character, or someone coming from either a play or a character of a play or a novel. But there aren't any symphonic poems based on Scott, and that's because by the end of the mid-19th century, end of the first half of the 19th century, Scott was already falling sort of out of fashion, and composers weren't really interested in using his storylines. But if you go a little earlier in the century and you come to Berlioz, he wrote 2 overtures, youthful ones that aren't terribly good, Rob Roy and Waverley Overture. And again, with the symphonic poem, keep in mind that Franz Liszt, the inventor of the symphonic poem, only writes the first one around 1848, 1849. And by then, Scott was a little over the hill. So that takes us to Lucia. And the composer was Gaetano Donizetti. He was born in 1797 in Bergamo and dies there in 1848. He is truly the successor to Rossini. Rossini stops composing operas in 1829 with Guillaume Tell. Still lives till 1868, but never composes another opera. And you do have Bellini, who comes along, who writes much less than Rossini or Donizetti, and was certainly very successful last years of his life, but he dies in 1835. In fact, the same year, or just actually a couple of weeks before the premiere of Lucia. And so then it's Donizetti who's truly the king of Italian opera until the advent of Verdi. And they coincide for a short spell. You've got Nabucco, in 1842 or so. Donizetti's still writing. He's slowed down tremendously. Don Pasquale, the last really good work, dates from 1845. And then he dies of a horrible disease and becomes paralyzed. Dies in 1848. But he was incredibly prolific, 66 operas in 27 years. And if you think of him at the age of 25, he's already composed 10 operas, 20 string quartets, 12 symphonias or overtures, 7 concerti, dozens of piano pieces and 47 religious works. And this great prolificness comes in part from his teacher, Simon Mayer, a German composer who settles in Bergamo and becomes his teacher. And he would send Donizetti off into a room and say, okay, compose a string quartet. And he would give him an hour. And, well, you'd write a string quartet. Maybe not within an hour, but pretty quickly. And so he became very adept at writing extremely fast. So that Lucia is written in less than 6 weeks, which is rather slow for him. Don Pasquale was written in 11 days. The Elixir of Love, another very fine work, was written in 2 weeks. So I guess you can teach someone how to write quickly, but you can't really teach someone how to write well, because he wrote very quickly, but out of 66 operas, there are only 4 or 5 that are in the repertory today. So we have Lucia being written for the San Carlo Theater in Naples, and his librettist is going to be Salvatore Camerano. Was born in 1801, dies in 1852. Camerano, who had worked and will work with Verdi, wrote libretti for 4 operas. His last, and he died before he completed it, was for Il Trovatore. And he'll do 8 libretti with Donizetti. This will be their first collaboration. And it's a huge success, understandably so. It's really a very fine opera. And will quickly spread around Italy, goes to Rome, goes to Milano, makes its way to Vienna the following year, to London, to Paris, comes to America in 1841 when it's given in French, because it's given in New Orleans, and then it's given in Italian in 1843. Proof of its popularity, it is the second opera to be performed at the Met. So the Met opens in October of 1883. Opening opera was Faust, Gounod, then comes Lucia. So from 1883 to 1987, it's going to get 308 performances over 65 seasons, which means you're between a season and a half and 2 seasons, you're going to get to hear it. And it remains extremely popular today, and the music is really a very high level. Wonderful tunes, including the very famous sextet, probably the greatest sextet in operatic history, which you will not hear today, I am sorry. No time for it. But of all of the serious bel canto operas, and bel canto I'm referring to the era of Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, and then a host of less good composers. Bel canto meaning beautiful singing, which was the object of these operas. Very tuneful, but also not easy to sing, like in the case of Lucia. It's really the one tragedy of this era that has remained a staple in the repertory. When you think of Rossini's operas, they get played on occasions, Semiramide and others, but they're not really staples in the repertory, but Lucia is. So we go to the opera itself. I guess I have to go through the plot, which I hope I'll remember. It's very convoluted, particularly when you take in the whole history of it. And I'll play some excerpts as we go along. What are we doing? Okay. So we are in southeastern Scotland. There is a region called Lammermoor. I can't pronounce it. So it's Lammermuir, Mrs. Muir. There we go. That was a TV series, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, which starred Charles Nelson Riley. He's on my mind at the moment. I watch him on reruns on the Johnny Carson show. He's very funny. So there is this, it's maybe a region of southeastern Scotland. And we have this terrible feud taking place, kind of like the McCoys and the Hatfields, between two aristocratic families. One is the Lammermoor family, or they're actually called the Ashtons. And then you have the Ravenswoods. The reason for the feud, and actually the hatred between these two families, is that long ago, one of the young girls of the Lammermoors was murdered in a jealous rage by a Ravenswood. And this has never been forgiven. Now, originally the Ravenswood were the primary family of this region. Very powerful, very wealthy, had a lot of land, had a great castle. But then they aligned themselves with the wrong political factions, and their fortunes went downhill while those of the Lammermoors rose, or the Ashtons. And to the extent that they would take over the property of the Ravenswoods and their castle, which actually is in ruins at this point of the story, and all that remains in the hands of the Ravenswoods, and there's one in particular, Edgardo, is a tower called Wolf's Craig. So this sets up the opera, and scene 1 of Act 1, we're introduced to really the villain of the piece, Enrico Ashton. And he is the brother of Lucia, pretty much her ward. And now his family has fallen on bad times. And they're lacking money, their political influence is very low, and he has to do something to resurrect his fortunes. And so his idea is to marry Lucia to Lord Bucklow, Arturo Bucklow, whose family is very wealthy, very well positioned politically. And Arturo is very much interested in this marriage. I guess Lucia was a very attractive woman. So in this opening scene, we have Enrico discussing this project with Raimondo, who's sort of the local pastor, Protestant pastor. And Raimondo is telling him, give Lucia some time because she just lost her mother and she is still in mourning. Now, in the novel, apparently, Lady Ashton plays a very predominant role and is even more of a villain than Enrico. But for whatever reason, they decided to leave her out, and so there's just a reference to her, and that's all. Now, the third character is Normanno, who, and I have to say, when you read the different accounts of the story, you go to the libretto, you go to libretto books, you go to Grove's Opera Encyclopedia, you get all this different information. Some of the characters have 3 or 4 different professions. Some of the places change. In our next scene, one source says it takes place at a fountain at Ravenswood Castle. Another says it takes place at Lammermoor Castle. So once again, you just have to pick the one you prefer. So for me, Normanno is the captain of the guard as well as a huntsman. And he reveals that Lucia has been corresponding and seeing Edgardo Ravenswood. Of course, this is a no-no. And what had happened, sort of off stage previously, is that Edgardo had saved her from a rampaging bull. And this led to love at first sight, and now they're seeing each other secretly. So Enrico's not very pleased at all about this, and the act ends with him calling for revenge. Also, there's mention that a prowler or an intruder has been seen on the grounds. They're on the grounds of the Ravenswood Castle, and so they're actually hunting him, but nothing comes of this. And so we come to scene 2, and we're at a fountain, and there's another one of these crazy productions at the Met. They've placed this story now in contemporary America in some downtrodden town in the Midwest. I think originally this director, an Australian, was thinking of having Lucia be a drug addict. Oh, that really would add a lot to the story. And why can't they just stick to the original? What I'm hoping is that the production at least has this fountain, because the fountain is crucial to this scene. And we meet Lucia, and she has her companion Eliza. And Eliza is warning him to stop seeing Edgardo, to break this off. This is going to lead to great trouble. And, of course, Lucia refuses. And she has an aria seated by the fountain where she relates the story of the ancestress who had been murdered and her body or corpse was thrown into the fountain. And when she's singing this, she envisions the fountain's waters turning bright red. Well, after that, Edgardo arrives, and of course they're both full of love. And he announces that he has to go off to France. It's for the Stuart cause. Now, the opera takes place around 1700, so this would be during the reign of William and Mary. And the Stuarts provided kings and queens of Scotland for several centuries. One of them, of course, Mary, Queen of Scots. And then in 1603, Scottish King James VI rose to the throne, English throne, and became James I. So he's uniting, by this gesture, Scotland and England. But the true unification, the union of Scotland and England, only takes place in 1707, and then it's a union of the two parliaments. So anyway, the Stuarts would contribute more kings. Charles I, the first English king to be beheaded, the only English king. Charles II, his son, all the way up to Queen Anne, who dies in 1714, and then, of course, we have the Hanovers taking over. So for some vague course having to do with the Stuarts, he has to go off to France. But before he does, they exchange rings, and they do sing a duet. And I thought we'd listen to the duet. This is, I've got two different Lucias today. I'm going to start off with Joan Sutherland. It's a very early recording, 1961. And I must say, this is one of the best things she ever did, her best recordings. She's a really wonderful voice. And the tenor is one that she discovered, an Italian, Renato Cioni, who did several recordings with her. And then, of course, she met Pavarotti, and, well, that was it for Cioni. Very little information about him. And so we'll listen to these two. This is conducted by Sir John Pritchard. I grew up with this recording. I'm rather glad they continued to have it come out on CD. Oh, and I just can't resist. I do have a Sir John Pritchard story, which has nothing to do with Lucia. But I had the opportunity to have lunch with him, not because he wanted to have lunch with me, but I was accompanying a friend of his. And he told this rather charming story. Sir John was gay, and he had one great lover named Terry. And he obviously was knighted, and he was on his way to Buckingham to be knighted. And in the morning, Terry apparently had been out shopping, and the car was full of groceries and other items. And they get to Buckingham Palace, and of course, they had to be checked for bombs and anything, so the guards went through the car, opened up the trunk, and in the trunk, it was full of toilet paper. And the guard turned to Sir John and said, "Are you figuring to be nervous, sir?" Anyway, that's my Pritchard story. We listened to the duet sung by Cioni and La Stupenza, Joan Sutherland. I hope this is right. Another reason I'm playing this is the main tune of the duet is going to be reprised in the famous Mad scene when she's singing about their encounter at the fountain. So that's obviously too loud. Okay. we go to Act 2, Scene 1, and we're in the private apartments of Enrico in Lammermoor Castle. And now he's very intent and being very dismissive of the feelings of Lucia. He's very intent on having this marriage take place. And Normanno, who's becoming the second most important villain in the piece, has come across letters being exchanged between Lucia and Edgardo, and he has forged a letter in which it's revealed, and of course it's a falsehood, that Edgardo is having an affair with somebody else. So Lucia comes into the room and is told, you have to marry Lord Bucklow. And of course she said she'd rather die. And then is shown the letter, and of course she's crestfallen. She believes it. And obviously she faints on the spot. And she has no choice. And on top of that, Enrico is doing the guilt thing on her, saying, listen, if you don't marry Arturo, the family is ruined, we have no money, and I could even wind up being executed. So to save me, you've got to marry Arturo. That's the end of Scene 1. Scene 2 begins with a wonderful chorus, which I'll play. This is I never could figure this out because they're like two wedding receptions. This is sort of the pre-marriage ceremony reception. So you have a lot of drinking and happiness. And I love the sound effects on this recording. This is still the same, Sir John Pritchard. Later on, Sutherland would record Lucia with Pavarotti. But I love the sound effects on this one. And you'll hear a very noisy group of people in the castle at this point. So we have Arturo, Normanno, Enrico, and the announcement that this marriage is going to take place. And Enrico is going to force Lucia to sign a wedding contract. And she does so, of course, very reluctantly. For her, it's not signing a contract of marriage, it's more signing a death warrant. She knows she's not going to be around much longer. And just after she signs it, who shows up? Edgardo, unannounced, uninvited. And, of course, he's in a filthy mood. And he asks her, are you really going to marry Arturo? And Enrico shows the document, and Edgardo demands a confirmation from Lucia that she actually signed it, and she says yes. Well, he takes off his ring and throws it on the ground, draws his sword on Enrico and Arturo. Then he drops his sword and said, hey, just do it now. But they just chase him away, and end of the act. And it's at this point that we have the famous sextet, each character singing about his or her feelings on the matter. Which takes us to Scene 2 of Act 2. God, I hope I'm right here. I'm sorry, this is scene 1 of Act 3. And now we're at the ruins of the Ravenswood's castle. We're at that tower, Wolf's Crag. And we have, we'll have this rather nice introductory music. Again, the sound effects are wonderful. This is taking place during a storm, need I say. You will realize this immediately. And I hope I did this right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That sounds like Last Night in Cornwall. Anyway, wonderful storm background music. And we find Edgardo, who you just heard, and he's going to be approached by Enrico, who's come to challenge him to a duel. And they agree on duel spot. It'll be the cemetery of Ravenswood the next morning. And this is a scene that I'm not sure the Met's going to do it. It's often left out. Certainly during the 19th century it was left out very often. Because this was considered really a vehicle for the soprano. She has so much music, so many difficult passages in that crazy mad scene that goes on for 20 minutes, that the men weren't as important. Even though you had a great tenor, Gilbert Dupré, who was the first Edgardo. He was also the first tenor to sing a full chested high C. But the spotlight was always on the soprano, so this scene was considered not very interesting. But the music isn't bad, and hey, great to have that thunderstorm, I think. So that's the end of that scene, and the second scene we go back to the castle of Lammermoor, and we have all these wedding guests again. And this is the scene of the famous mad moment. And everybody is very festive, and Raimondo comes out and puts a damper on things, saying that Lucia has murdered Arturo. And sure enough comes Lucia in her white gown, and, covered in blood, and she has her big mad scene. And she's led away. And following that, we have a last scene, and it's just very unusual in opera. The concluding scene of the opera, the spotlight is on the tenor. There's no soprano singing here. There's no duet. It's just the tenor. And he's awaiting Enrico, this is Edgardo, at the cemetery for the duel. But instead comes a procession from the castle, and they tell him that Lucia is dying. And then Raimondo appears, and you hear the death bells, and Edgardo says, I want to go and see her, and he says, no point, she's already died. And he takes out a dagger and stabs himself. End of opera. So I thought we'd listen to most of the mad scene. I'm switching sopranos. This is my favorite, Edita Gruberova. You may recall her from Ariadne auf Naxos. And not the best recording she made, but again, when you compare to Sutherland, It's so musical. She does so many different things with her voice. Whereas Sutherland, it's technically perfect, a much more pretty trill than Gruberova, but it's always the same. I mean, she could be singing Verdi, she could be singing Turandot, she could be singing Donizetti. There's never any change in style. And nor is there a great difference in dynamics. You never get a fortissimo, you never get a pianissimo. I believe it's in this segment. There's a simply incredible pianissimo. You can barely hear her, but she's still singing, and she goes from full-throated singing to that, Gruberova. So I'm going to stick with her with this. It's still excellent singing. And I will stop it at one point because then there's interaction between her and the audience and the group that's at the in the Great Hall, and I'll just skip from that to the finale of the Mad Scene. So here we go. Making sure I got the right one. Yep, I do. Silence kills. Come on. Oh, here we go. I take back what I said. That's just incredible singing. Inhuman. How anyone can sing like that. The crescendos, the diminuendos, changing the color of the voice, the glissandi, the pianissimi, which is just unbelievable. Anyway, here's the end of the mad scene. 214. there you have it. I hope that came through. That is just unbelievable singing. Why this singer didn't have more of a reputation than she had in this country is beyond me. Anyway, that's it. End of our opera season. I did check out the Metropolitan Opera schedule for next year. Not terribly exciting, and there are a couple of modern operas. Another one by Terence Blanchard, God help us, that I will skip. But there are a couple of interesting operas, and ones I don't think I've done before. Otherwise, we've got Cubano music in the summertime, which should be fun, something a little bit different. I think I said this last time, but I see Marilyn is unaware of it, so I'll repeat myself, that there was a thriving musical society, classical music society in Cuba during the 19th century, early 20th. A lot of Cuban composers, a lot of very fine pianists, and there is some good music out there that we never get to hear. Blame it on Castro or I don't know who, but there it is. So I hope you'll tune in, and we have a first program in July, a second one in August. And I hope to see you then. If there are any questions,